It is the Martha Zoller Show, and joining me right now is Todd Starnes, and his new book is called Twilight / Gleaming. And I appreciate you being with us, Todd. How are you?
Well, thanks, Martha. Yeah, I thought, wait a second, is that my voice? Am I having a medical episode here?
Yeah, that's what it feels like, right?
Oh, my goodness. Well, it's great to be with you today. And, wow, thank you for having me on the show.
Well, I tell you what, I loved what you had to say because, there's a lot of data showing that, we like to blame young people for everything, right? But this younger generation, like we see on the news, the 18 to 24-year-olds that are on the fringe. But what we're seeing, what I'm seeing in the data is that it's kind of this return to more conservative values. They're more religious. They're getting back to church, that we're seeing some hope among young people.
Yes, I was in Santa Barbara last week speaking at the Young America's Foundation National Teen Conservative Conference, and I was really encouraged to see the students there and the numbers, and especially from California schools who were there to learn about what it means to be a conservative, to learn about our founding documents, our founding fathers, and of course to visit the historic Reagan Ranch there in Santa Barbara.
So your book, Twilight / Gleaming, Can America Be Saved? Can America be saved?
Yes, it can, but I had to write 75,000 words, Martha, so I decided to expand on what I meant by that. Yes, America can be saved, but the question is, are we willing to do the work that needs to be done to save America? And I remembered a speech many years ago that Reagan delivered, and he made a point that our national anthem starts with a declaration, and does not start with a declaration, but it actually starts with a question. Do you still see the flag flying? And that's a question that every age, every generation must answer. Freedom is not passed along in the bloodstream, as Reagan said in another speech, that every generation has to fight for freedom. And that's the question that I pose in the book. Are we doing that? Are we fighting for freedom? And I certainly think that Generation Z is doing that.
And I do think that we do run in these cycles. In the 1920s, we had prohibition, we had rampant lawlessness, we had lots of violence in the cities, and a lot of unrest. We didn't have social media. Radio was just starting, but so you didn't hear about it as much, obviously, but there were similar cycles. In the 1970s, starting in the late 1960s, we had, assassinations, and we had violence in the cities, and people started moving to the suburbs, and there was unrest, and that ushered in the Reagan era. We're kind of 50 years on from that. Are we in one of these kind of unsettled eras that we're going to be ushered into something better, or does it take work to do that?
Well, I believe that we are at an inflection point in our nation's history once again, and I think this particular election cycle is really going to determine what we are and who we become. And it is a dangerous time in American history, no doubt about that. I start the book out taking folks back to the speech that President Biden gave in Philadelphia with the blood red lights and the ominous setting, which I contend was somewhat demonic in nature. And I asked the question, where do we go from here? Reagan promised to bring morning to America. And if you remember, President Biden predicted a dark winter, and President Biden delivered on that promise. We have been through a dark winter. And so I think, Martha, if you're looking at maybe a comparison, going back to the Jimmy Carter-Ronald Reagan race where there was this melees in America, I think we're at that point again, and that's why I believe that President Trump is going to win and win significantly in the fall.
I think you're right about that. I also, though, get concerned that in the primaries last night, that even though on both sides, roughly 20% of the people that went out to vote, 15 to 20%, depending on the state, voted for other candidates than their presumptive nominees, both on Democrat and Republican side. And I think there's still some work to be done to bring people back into the fold and back together. But also, Reagan was a very positive communicator. And Trump, I wouldn't say he's negative, but he's a different kind of communicator, right?
Well,
So,
I would disagree with that,
okay.
Martha. I think there are great similarities between Reagan and Trump. As a matter of fact, it was Reagan who coined the phrase "Make America Great Again." But when you go back and look at how Reagan became president, I mean, the establishment Republican hated that man. They wanted to destroy Ronald Reagan. There were brutal fights along the way, but Ronald Reagan, persevered, and certainly he is more winsome, I would say, than maybe President Trump is. But I think a lot of that comes from his raising in the Midwest and from his Hollywood acting skills. President Trump came from Queens, New York, so even if you're on the wealthy side of Queens, it's still Queens. So I hear what you're saying, but the establishment wing of the party for generations has been very aggressive in their nominees. You will either support our candidate or you will shut up. So now that conservatives are sort of in that, driver's seat, I think now the establishment is getting a little bit of a taste of their own medicine that they've been force feeding, the rest of the party for generations.
Look, my dad was from Jersey City and worked in New York, so I know, I that was the thing that I always understood about Donald Trump, okay, because I understood how how they talk. And my dad was that same kind of guy that if you hit him, he was going to hit you back twice as hard. I understood that. I do think that as this moves forward, okay, there is roughly about 20% of Republican primary voters. And I don't know how that extrapolates out to general election voters. But I think that we have established that President Trump has his base. He has his base, no matter what, that base is with him. I think the question is now, what do they do now with very needed new leadership in the Republican Party? What do they do to bring people to us rather than pushing away?
I don't know. I mean, President Trump is going to be President Trump. I will say that I think it's really incumbent upon those whatever the 20%, whoever those people are. I think they have to, I'm not sure what the clinical definition is, but they've got to suck it up. We had to do that with John McCain, had to do that with Mitt Romney. Look, I had to do that. I was a Rick Perry fan back in the day,
right.
Big supporter. So I think that we all have to come to terms with the fact that we may not get what we want, but if we stay home on Election Day, we're going to get what we don't need in this country.
No, absolutely, because there's more at stake here. It's the best opportunity to win back the Senate that we're going to have in several cycles. We've got to have a bigger majority in the House, and we've got to continue. What really led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade was the fact that conservatives started winning state houses all over the country, and we started really dominating in those state houses, and we were able to push that legislation up that ultimately led to Dobbs and led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We've got to maintain that strength on the state level also. So there's a lot at stake here in this next election.
Oh, absolutely. And I write about this in the book, and reminding people of what we're fighting for and what this fight is ultimately about. Going back to and you could probably go back to the 1930s, but I went back to the 1960s where you had William F. Buckley Jr. and Ronald Reagan really setting out the foundation for what is the modern conservative movement. And this idea that, and again, back in the 1950s and 60s, we were fighting the communists. And I think what is old is new again. And that's the problem that we're dealing with now. We call them progressives or leftists, but I think they're just the same run-of-the-mill old-fashioned communists. And Reagan and Buckley knew that this was not really a political fight, that this ultimately was a religious fight. This was good versus evil, right versus wrong. And that's how that fight was framed back in the 1950s and 60s. And I think that's how we're going to have to frame the fight today.
No, I agree with you that these things run in cycles, and progressives, whatever you want to call them, they never give up. I mean, whether they kind of came out of the whole Wilson era. I mean, not that they didn't exist beforehand, but that's when they first started being kind of noted through the Wilson era, and they don't give up. They just reform themselves. And that's what we have to really be aware of. Well, the book is Twilight's Last Gleaming. Love the title. Can America Be Saved? And Todd, I appreciate very much you being with us today. Where can people get this book?
Well, Martha, if you have a Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, wherever you buy your books, you'll be able to go and get a copy. You can also, of course, order online, Amazon, or if you would like a personally signed copy, I will be happy to do that. Just go to toddstarnes.com and click on our store.
Todd, appreciate your work. You're such a beacon for conservative thought, and we appreciate you being with us today.